Hi folks, we're going to go over some quick notes that cover some of the stuff you read about for today and some of the stuff from the previous day. And we'll carry on, finish these notes our next class, probably. So we're just about done with this unit. I'm sorry I'm not here today. Anyway, let's get started. These won't take very long, maybe 15 minutes or so. Who knows? So we're going to look at today different migration patterns. And first, let's cover the really simple basics. And as I'm going over these, of course, if you have stuff like this down in your notes already, there's no point in writing these notes again. If you already have it, why bother? If, on the other hand, you feel like something I'm saying is new to you, probably worth writing it down. But a lot of this is pretty straightforward. I don't even know if you would need to ever write this down. These are things that many people just know. Or at this point, hopefully you feel like you don't even need to memorize. Like immigrants are people leaving a country, and they are often leaving because of push factors, which are often negative. So perhaps you end up being in an area where there's an earthquake, so you leave, or a hurricane, or the economy crashes, or a dictator takes over, or you are being persecuted for religious or other reasons. Immigration, of course, is the opposite. It's when you enter a country, and this is usually because of pull factors, which are positive, generally. Again, not worth writing all this stuff down if it's obvious and well-known, or if you already have it. An immigrant, of course, and an immigrant would be the same person, just different circumstances. So if you are a person leaving the United States, you would be an immigrant. And then as soon as you enter, let's say, Canada, then you would be an immigrant. So you're the same person playing two different roles. You're an immigrant and an immigrant. Sometimes this is surprising to people or confusing. Second to last, net migration, I think we may know at this point, is whether a country is gaining or losing immigrants, or it could apply to another scale. If you'd rather not talk about a country, you could talk about Illinois or Chicago or a region. But as long as you're adding up all the total immigrants and subtracting the immigrants, then you would hopefully figure out whether you have a positive or negative net migration rate. If it's positive, it means you have more immigrants coming into your country than people leaving. If it's negative, there's more people leaving than coming in. Finally, stating the obvious, international migration, also known as transnational migration, is simply migration where people are crossing a country border. So going from the United States to Canada would make you an international migrant. Whereas if you're just going, of course, from like Texas to Oklahoma, you are not an international migrant. Before I go through the characteristics of a typical migrant, you may have read about them, I can't remember. Think to yourself if you could answer these questions. Try and answer them in your head. For example, do you think the typical migrant, the usual migrant, is male or female? I think your book did talk about this, and I thought they talked about it in a misleading way. In fact, my opinion doesn't matter, says my wife. Do you think the typical migrant is usually male or female? What about the typical age range of this migrant? You think they're usually migrating starting around the age of 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, keep it to like a decade range. And like, when do they typically stop migrating? So most migrants, what's the age range that they might be migrating within? Why are they migrating? We've answered that question before, but it's a good review question. Why are they usually migrating? Are they usually going far or a long distance? Are they usually going to a city or a rural area? Do they usually have a family, or are they single? These are questions which hopefully you can intuitively answer, at least most of. If you're not sure, let's go over it. That guy sort of represents a typical migrant in a lot of ways. Maybe you're wondering why he's a typical migrant. I could ask you a similar question. Why is he so happy? Is he happy because he made it to a city? Because he just got a job? Because he finally ditched his family? Or all the above? Maybe all of the above. Assuming that all those things are true, then he generally represents what appears to be a typical migrant in photo form. He is somebody who is male. He is within the typical working age, let's call it 20 to 50, roughly. He appears to have gotten a new job. And now, at least according to my fictitious circumstance, he is single, newly single, ready to mingle. So hopefully that photo will at least stick in your brain a bit. But that guy is probably what a lot of migrants are like, although of course he seems better off. Many migrants are much, much poorer. So typical migrants are male, single, or have no kids, about 20 to 50. They're migrating for work. They usually go to more urban areas, and they usually move short distances. This is what is called steppe migration. Let's say you are growing up in an extreme circumstance, but extreme examples often are easy to grasp, even though they're not common. This is still going to be pretty common. Let's say you grow up in an isolated area or a very, very rural area. I'm not talking about necessarily like southern Illinois on a farm, although that could still be considered pretty isolated around here. Let's say you're somebody who's like from middle of nowhere, India, very tiny town. Probably don't even have access to television or internet. If you were to move somewhere, what kinds of obstacles or challenges would you face that would be really hard to overcome if you moved from that tiny middle of nowhere locale to like Mumbai, this giant city in India, or perhaps you moved a bit farther to like Mecca, Saudi Arabia? What challenges would you face? Perhaps you're thinking to yourself, well, that's a long distance. I wonder if I would even have any connections in that city. If I were coming from a tiny place, probably don't know many people. If I need help, how am I going to get help if I don't know anybody? That would be tough. You may know cities are generally more expensive than rural areas. Probably wouldn't be able to afford to live in a city very long unless somehow you were coming from a wealthy family in a rural area. So that's an obstacle, obviously a very realistic obstacle. You need money to buy things. You might not have a connection to get a job or a skill that's worthwhile to beat out lots of other people who are looking for a job. You might also be unable to find a place to live. You may not have the ability to know where to look. You may not have had that experience before. Tons of other potential obstacles. And all of this makes it an overwhelming task if many people are going to try and make this move from a small town to a giant city. That's why people don't usually do these moves in giant steps. They instead take smaller steps. They might move from a small town to a slightly larger town, or a small town to a middle-sized city, then from a middle-sized to a large city, then a large city to a big city, like a giant city. Otherwise, it's just too difficult. So steppe migration is this idea of going from smaller to larger and larger areas because it's generally more manageable, more affordable. You've got more connections. It's easier to go back home or get help. Hopefully that makes sense. So these characteristics should be embedded in your brain. A couple other migration patterns worth going over you read about. One known as Ravenstein's laws of migration. Generally, I think these are true, even though they're called laws. I kind of disagree with them, and I don't think they should be called laws. I think it's more of a theory. For example, this one I just generally have the biggest issue with. Every migration generates a return or counter migration. I don't know if that's really true all the time. I think you can find some truths to it. For example, lots and lots of migrants from Mexico have been coming to the US over the last 50 years, and many of them often end up returning home to Mexico. Similarly, when the United States in the early 1900s had tons and tons of Italian migrants come here, only about a third of them stayed permanently. Many of them came here for work, worked for a few years, sent money home, made a lot of money, and then went back home themselves. So only a few stayed, about a third. However, you could also find a similar example with Mexicans. People from Mexico come here, and lots of people from here end up going to Mexico. even if it's for something temporary. But some people do tend to move there. So I think there's truth to this, but I don't think it's necessarily a law. Other things that are more common include this idea of moving a short distance. We've already kind of talked about this, but most migrants are going to move a short distance for all those challenging reasons that are involved when you move a long distance. I mean, even if you were to move from Chicago to another big city around the world, like let's say to Hong Kong, that's still going to provide you with lots of challenges. You may not speak the language there. They do speak English, but you may not have connections. You may not be familiar with how public transit works or signing up for residence or getting a job. Everything's different, right? Or a lot of things would be different. So a lot of migrants choose to move short distances, and this is emblematic of a term from Unit 1, distance decay. If you do move a longer distance, those migrants that go a long distance are probably going to be going to a big city. So it's unlikely that if you are going to go from Chicago to China, that you're going to end up in somewhere in Western China where there's like very few well-known big cities. Instead, you're probably going to go to another big city because that's probably where the jobs are. In addition, these urban migrants will probably migrate less than rural residents. This may sound surprising, but remember that urban areas are where people are drawn to. So why would you leave an urban area? Once you're there, there's a lot of reason to stay there. So people that migrate are often going to be going from rural to urban areas. Families will migrate less than young adults. Once you've got a family, you're kind of tied down. You've got to make sure that you're looking out for not just yourself, but also your spouse or a significant other and your children. So you can't just move willy-nilly because you're considering all these other things that your family will need. And it's risky to move when you may not be able to find a job. And then you're not just out of a place to live and food to eat, so is your family, or where do your kids go to school? So all this stuff makes it more challenging for families to move. There's also a guy named Zielinski who came up with what's known as the migration transition model. It overlaps pretty well with the demographic transition model. You just kind of have to think about it a bit and figure out how it applies. Basically, his model is oriented around whether a country is going to have people migrating into or out of it, depending on what stage they are in of development. And again, it kind of pairs up with the demographic transition model. So here's the short summary. In stage 1 of the demographic transition model, people generally don't migrate in or out of the country. The country is so undeveloped that most of the people in that country are probably rural, maybe even hunter-gatherers, and are really only going somewhere for their next meal. So this is the only stage where you have internal migration, people not really going anywhere outside the country or people coming into that country. It's probably not a very desirable place to be anyway, judging by the fact that with high death rates, it's not a very healthy place to be, and with high birth rates, many women probably don't have a lot of opportunities. Stage 2, your country's death rate is decreasing, of course, and emigration is going to be more likely. People are going to be more likely to leave in stage 2 because when there's this big gap between the birth rate, which is still high at this point, and the death rate, you are going to end up having a hugely growing population, meaning that you will have overcrowding issues, people having trouble finding jobs, and that will mean that people will want to go overseas so they can find other opportunities or to another country. Stage 3 and 4 are very similar since the country now is solving some of these issues related to overcrowding. For example, by providing women with an education which gives them more opportunities. This makes the country more stable population-wise, less children being born, makes the country more desirable because women now have more opportunities. So people will tend to migrate into countries like this, and you'll have less and less internal migration. The stuff about forced migration, I'll probably get into, and then I'll talk about voluntary migration the next class. So we'll end it here on this slide about forced migration. Forced migration is often international migration. You do find people who are going to migrate domestically within the country's borders. Those people are called internally displaced migrants, but quite often the people who are forced to migrate are moving internationally. They are usually called refugees. Here's a sad story. This photo, which was around 2015, of a boy who washed upon the shores of the Mediterranean named Alan Kurdi. Was taken by a photographer and became a very sad photograph that many people around the world saw as symbolic of the struggle of many people from Syria who have been leaving the last few years because of the civil war. They are leaving a country trying to get anywhere else, taking many risks just to get wherever they can go that's not in the middle of a war and may provide them with opportunity. So in this case, this father and I believe his wife and 2 children managed to get a boat and try to cross the Mediterranean, as thousands do try to do every day. The Mediterranean is basically like an ocean. It's massive, it's horribly dangerous, and many people don't make it. That was the case for this father, who unfortunately was the only one to survive out of these 4 people. His wife died, his 2 children died as their boat capsized shortly after leaving the shore. And this photo was taken of a government worker documenting the child as he had washed up on the shore. It's super sad. So these people would have been deemed refugees by an organization like the UN. Refugee is like a legal status. It's bestowed often by international organizations, and the status sort of bestows upon people certain rights and privileges that other international migrants who are moving, perhaps because of a forced situation like natural disaster, that those people don't necessarily get. So refugees are like well, I've already said it, it's a status. If you're not a refugee, you might be an asylum seeker. If you're an asylum seeker, you're still looking for help, but you haven't been given this legal status of a refugee. Asylum seekers then are often kind of put in this limbo of wondering whether they will be allowed to enter countries. Not that refugees have carte blanche to just go wherever they want because they're refugees, but they are given more leeway, whereas asylum seekers kind of have to ask permission to stay in a place. Refugees, while they aren't necessarily given cushy lodgings, are often at least given a place to stay, usually in what you've heard of is called a refugee camp, which can be pretty awful. But when you consider what they're leaving, many are at least happy to have safety. So asylum seekers are unauthorized immigrants, whereas refugees are usually authorized. Many people seeking asylum are, shockingly, even leaving the United States. I won't bother going to this website because it's just going to take up more time, but the headline there tells you everything you need to know. Montreal in Canada, a couple of years ago, turned a stadium into a welcome center for asylum seekers from the U.S. Who would have ever thought that the U.S. would get to the point where people are trying to leave here to seek safety somewhere else? This is supposed to be the place where we welcome people. But the last few years, the climate for immigrants and foreigners in this country has turned very negative, and many people have found it unsafe to be here and have started to leave. That's an interesting sign of the times. Final thing to talk about, internally displaced people, I've already mentioned, are people who are forced to migrate but stay within their own country. You may be able to think of an example in the US of people who are internally displaced within our own country. For example, people that are victims of the fires in California have moved from wherever their home was to somewhere else, a parking lot in Walmart, relatives' home. Similarly, people in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina in 2005 left to many adjacent states. Of course, some went farther away, but many stayed within the nearby area, states like Alabama or Southeast Texas. So internally displaced people will usually be going just between or within one region as a result of some bad event, like a hurricane or some localized problem. That's about it. I'll end it here. I hope that you found this helpful. If you have questions, let me know, but I'll see you guys next class. Don't forget to take the reading quiz if you haven't done that yet, and hopefully your quarter 1 projects are going well. That's it. Have a great day. Bye-bye.